On the morning of Friday, October 29th, 1948, a young woman named Helen Stack woke up inside her modest home in the small town of Donora, Pennsylvania. And as soon as Helen opened her eyes, she started coughing. Her throat had been sore for a few days, but this morning it felt even worse. She thought she might be coming down with a cold, but Helen was not the kind of person to let a minor illness slow her down. So she still got out of bed, got dressed, and then drank some coffee and ate breakfast before starting her walk to work. From where her house stood near the top of a hill, Helen could sometimes see the entire town. Donora sat inside of a valley right on the banks of the Monongahela River, surrounded on three sides by 400-foot-tall cliffs. On the fourth side were rolling hills that stretched off into the distance. That morning, though, Helen couldn't see any of Donora's natural beauty, because fog was blocking her view. In fact, low gray clouds had been hanging over the town for the past 4 days. But that was actually normal, because Donora was inside of basically a natural bowl in the earth. The surrounding cliffs and hills blocked the wind, so the fog would accumulate and then get stuck in the valley. To Helen, this was just part of life in Donora. And while it was sort of frustrating at times, it was easy to ignore, because there were so many other good things about living there. Everybody was friendly, there were plenty of jobs, and there were always fun events going on. As she walked to work, Helen could hardly see across the street, but she could see enough in front of her to say hello to the neighbors who passed her by on her side of the sidewalk, who all knew her by name. And then at some point she passed by a street next to a bunch of industrial mills that were also shrouded in fog, and she knew that somewhere in that fog, most of the men in Donora were working. And when she reached McKean Avenue, the main street in town, she could barely make out the workers who were hanging up decorations for that evening's annual Halloween parade. Eventually, Helen came to a stop in front of a tall brownstone building on McKean Avenue. She went inside, walked up to the second floor, and unlocked the door of the doctor's office where she worked. Helen was the only employee working for the two doctors, Ralph Kohler and Edward Roth. To Helen, these two men seemed pretty similar. Both were in their 40s, they were tall and heavy-set, and they both had very kind and patient demeanors. The only obvious difference between them was that Dr. Roth smoked cigars like a chimney, and Dr. Kohler avoided cigars altogether because he had diabetes and a heart condition. As for Helen, she was a receptionist, a secretary, and a nurse, so she had a lot of responsibilities at the office. And today, like most days, she was the first one to the office. She turned on the lights and opened up the blinds in the waiting room, then began sweeping up the thin layer of soot that had blown in through the air vents and settled on the floor overnight. Like the fog in Donora, the soot was also very annoying, but totally normal to Helen. She knew it came from the mills nearby. It was just a normal part of living in a factory town inside of a valley. After Helen was all done cleaning up the waiting room, she looked around and smiled, because she had just enough time to go smoke a cigarette before the doctors came in and patients began to arrive. Helen sat down behind the reception desk and lit her cigarette. She took a long drag, but immediately she noticed it had a strange bittersweet taste to it. She tried again, and suddenly the tobacco tasted so awful that she doubled over coughing. She coughed until she had tears in her eyes, but she wasn't sure if it was from the cigarette, her sore throat, or maybe both. Either way, Helen stubbed out the half-smoked cigarette into her ashtray, and then she heard the door open. She looked up to see Dr. Kohler walking inside, and so she knew her workday was about to begin. A few hours later, at 3 p.m., Dr. Kohler stood in the back of the doctor's office and pulled on his overcoat. Even though it was only mid-afternoon, he already felt exhausted. His diabetes and his heart condition left him chronically tired, and to deal with it, he kept to a very specific schedule. He went home every day at precisely 3 p.m. so he could lay down and rest before dinner. But right when he was about to leave, he heard quick footsteps coming down the hallway, and Helen rounded the corner. She looked concerned and said an older man had just come in, wheezing and complaining that he couldn't catch his breath. Dr. Kohler knew he needed to get home for his own sake, but his partner, Dr. Roth, had already gone on a break, and he couldn't just turn away a patient who needed help. So he took off his overcoat and told Helen to bring the patient back to an exam room. Moments later, Dr. Kohler met that patient in the exam room, and he recognized him as one of his regulars. The man was one of many locals in town who Dr. Kohler treated for asthma, which is a chronic condition that causes a person's airways to swell and make it difficult to breathe. And so as a result, Dr. Kohler wasn't surprised that this patient was wheezing. Whenever the fog in Donora got really thick, people's asthma tended to flare up. So Dr. Kohler gave his patient the usual asthma treatment for 1948, which was a shot of adrenaline. Adrenaline is a hormone that can help open a person's airway when they're having trouble breathing. Once the adrenaline shot took effect and the man caught his breath again, Dr. Kohler sent him on his way. Then the doctor put his overcoat back on and followed that patient out, anxious to go home and get in bed. "30 minutes later, Helen sat at the reception desk and flicked through the day's mail. Usually, the office got quiet in the afternoons, and then business would pick up again in the evenings. So she was using the lull to get some administrative work done. Helen pulled out the junk mail from the pile and then got up to throw it away. But as she was walking towards the trash can, she heard a loud crash from the hallway outside the office, followed by the sound of somebody yelling. Helen's first thought was somebody fell down the stairs, and so she rushed to check if they were okay, and what she saw in the hallway absolutely terrified her. A man she didn't recognize was clinging to the banister, and his knuckles were white and his face was turning blue. He was moaning in pain, kicking the wall and screaming, help me, I'm dying!" Helen was so confused and afraid that she just froze. Luckily, another doctor who ran his own private practice across the hall from them soon showed up, and so did the other doctor that Helen worked for, Dr. Roth. While those two doctors began to help the man, Helen heard the sound of her phone ringing at her reception desk. And so Helen kind of broke out of her trance, ran back inside the office and answered the phone, and immediately she heard the sound of a woman screaming on the other end of the line for help, just like the blue-faced man in the hall had been doing. The woman said her husband couldn't breathe and he needed help right now. Helen got the woman's address and promised that Dr. Roth would be there soon. However, before Helen could run across the hall and tell Dr. Roth that another patient needed his help, the phone rang again, and then again, and then again. And everyone Helen spoke to said the same thing. They couldn't breathe, they were coughing up blood, their heads hurt, their stomachs were killing them, and they all thought they were going to die. And unfortunately, the town only had a single ambulance, and it was booked solid. And so one after another, Helen took down these people's names and addresses and added them to the growing list of patients the doctors needed to visit. Helen had no idea what was going on in Donora, but it certainly felt like all hell had broken loose inside of her normally quiet town. Two hours later, at 6 p.m., Dr. Roth squinted as he very slowly drove down McKean Avenue after an afternoon of house calls. Because of the fog, which now had gotten so bad, he could hardly make out the lines on the road, and so he just gripped the steering wheel tightly and went really slow, keeping an eye out for the brownstone building where he worked. Dr. Roth had never been in a situation like this before. People all over town were struggling to breathe, regardless of whether they had asthma or not, and Dr. Roth really didn't know why. He figured it must be something in the air, literally, but even with fog this bad, he'd never seen it affect people this much before. By this point in the day, he'd already given so many patients adrenaline injections that he'd run through his entire supply, and he'd barely made a dent in the list of people who still needed help. And so now he needed to stop by the office and refill his supply of adrenaline before making more house calls. But it was literally too foggy to even find his own address. And so Dr. Roth figured he'd have better luck if he just parked his car and walked. So he carefully pulled to the curb, turned off the engine, and got out. He went to the sidewalk, and when he saw the nearest building to him, he realized he'd actually driven past his office without knowing it. And so Dr. Roth doubled back towards the brownstone, threw open the door, and began running up the stairs. However, after only a few steps, he had to stop because he ran out of breath, and then he began to cough. His chest felt tight, like somebody was squeezing the air out of him. He managed to make it back to his office, but immediately when he got there, he doubled over in the entryway and coughed until tears were streaming down his face. Dr. Roth felt like he was choking. He started to panic and looked around for help, but his secretary, Helen, had left for dinner, and his colleague, Dr. Kohler, who had left to go take a nap, was still at home. Dr. Roth realized he was all alone in his office. He held onto a desk and tried to steady himself, but he kept hacking until he felt nauseous. He managed to make it to the bathroom before he actually vomited. And then after that, he stumbled to the bathroom sink and splashed cold water on his face. His heart was racing and his whole body felt weak, but he knew he couldn't just stand there because he still felt faint. So he rushed towards the back room where drugs were stored and grabbed a vial of adrenaline and a clean syringe. With his hands shaking, Dr. Roth filled the syringe, poked the needle through his pant leg into his thigh, and injected himself with adrenaline. And after that, he just collapsed into his office chair. After a few moments, Dr. Roth took a big, deep breath. He sat there for several minutes, relishing how good it felt to breathe again. And as he slowly calmed back down, Dr. Roth tried to figure out what had just happened to him. Just like the patients he'd been visiting all day, he'd had what seemed like a sudden, very severe asthma attack. But why? He felt sure that something in the air, in the fog, was causing people all over town, including him, to nearly suffocate. But what? Fog was normal in Denora, so what was different about it this time? As he was thinking it over, Dr. Roth opened up a drawer in his desk, and out of pure habit, he grabbed a cigar. Without thinking, he struck a match, lit the cigar, and took a puff. And immediately, he launched into another uncontrollable coughing fit. Meanwhile, Helen was on her way back to work after her dinner break. She walked through the fog and past a crowd of people gathered on McKean Avenue. There were adults and kids, all dressed up in festive costumes. Helen knew they were all waiting for the annual Halloween parade to begin. But she couldn't think about candy and costumes right now. She was too preoccupied with getting back to work and making sure her patients were okay. She soon made it to the brownstone and went upstairs to the doctor's office. And right when she opened the door, she heard the phone ring. But before she could answer it, she heard something else. There was a groaning sound coming from the back hallway. It made the hair on the back of Helen's neck stand up, because Dr. Kohler and Dr. Roth were supposed to be at home on their dinner breaks. Helen should have been alone at the office. She followed the groaning sound back to Dr. Roth's private office, and she opened the door to find one of her bosses slumped in his chair. His face was bright red and drenched in sweat, he was wheezing, and his eyes were huge and terrified. But somehow, Dr. Roth spoke, and he told Helen he was okay. He just needed to catch his breath. Helen did not believe him, but she could still hear the phone ringing, and Dr. Roth told her to just go answer it. And so perhaps against her better judgment, she turned and left, and when she got back into the waiting room to answer the phone, she now saw there were a few patients that had come inside. She gestured to let them know she'd be with them in a second, and then she answered the phone. But this time, Helen didn't hear a patient begging for help. She heard her other boss, Dr. Kohler, and his voice sounded strained. He said that ever since he had left the office earlier that afternoon, he'd been struggling to breathe too, and he said he didn't know when he'd be able to come back to work. Helen said okay, but it really was not okay, because as she stood there holding the phone to her ear, the office door swung open and more coughing, wheezing patients tumbled inside. Helen felt so confused and helpless. Half the town was outside enjoying the Halloween parade, totally oblivious to what was happening. Meanwhile, the phone wouldn't stop ringing and patients were flooding into the doctor's office one after another. And the doctors, Dr. Kohler and Dr. Roth, were both deathly ill, and no one actually knew what was causing any of this. Helen felt like she had no choice but to close the office, because there was nothing Dr. Kohler or Dr. Roth could do for anybody. So she hung up the phone and turned around and told the patients gathered in the waiting room that she was very sorry, but they would have to leave and go to a different doctor's office for help. About 7 hours later, a man named Rudolf Schwerha was lying in bed with his wife. They were both fast asleep until the sound of the phone ringing jolted them awake. Rudolf rolled over, looked at the clock on his bedside table, and sighed. It was 2 a.m., which meant the call could not be good news. And that was because Rudolf was both a mortician and the county coroner. He lived right above the funeral home that he owned and operated, and he only got calls in the middle of the night if somebody had died. Rudolf picked up the phone and said hello, and sure enough, The woman on the other end, a dispatcher at the local sheriff's office, said a 70-year-old man had passed away about half an hour earlier. She said he'd suddenly developed severe respiratory symptoms and stopped breathing. Rudolph did not ask any follow-up questions because it was 2 a.m. and he wasn't really thinking straight, and also because he was totally unaware of the mysterious illness currently plaguing Denora. He just asked the woman for the address, and then said he would send his hearse to pick up the man's remains. Rudolph then called his hearse driver and explained the situation, and the driver said he was on it and would bring the remains back to the funeral home soon. Rudolph hung up, and while his wife went back to sleep, he laid there, awake in bed, and listened for the sound of the hearse pulling into his driveway. He figured the driver would show up within minutes because the address was only 2 blocks away. But half an hour passed by before Rudolph finally heard a car's engine rumbling outside. Rudolph was about to get up to go greet the driver, but as soon as he threw back the covers, his phone rang again. And again, it's the middle of the night, and so these calls are not good news. Rudolph noticed his wife had just woken up, and she sat up next to him, looking confused. Rudolph picked up the phone and said hello, and he was surprised to hear that another person had passed away. And like the first, they'd suddenly developed severe breathing problems and then just died. 2 deaths within an hour of each other was unusual in a town as small as Denora, and it was even more strange for 2 people to just suddenly stop breathing. Rudolph didn't know what was going on, but now he felt uneasy, and he decided he should go with his driver to the next address. So Rudolph told his wife he'd be back soon, then he got dressed and hurried outside. A few minutes later, Rudolph rode in the passenger seat while his hearse driver inched down the street. It had taken the driver so long to get to the funeral home because the fog outside had somehow gotten even worse. It was like a solid gray wall. As the driver slowly inched forward, Rudolph stared intently out the windshield, desperately trying to somehow see through the fog. They were headed to a neighborhood on the opposite side of the Monongahela River, and to get there, they would have to drive across a very thin road right next to a cliff. And so Rudolph, naturally, was very concerned that they might accidentally drive right off of it. So when they neared the cliff, Rudolph told the driver to stop and said he wanted to drive, but he would still need the driver's help. While Rudolph got behind the wheel of the hearse, the driver got outside and stood in front of the car. Then he used a flashlight to guide Rudolph through the fog and make sure the car didn't slip off the side of the cliff. And so Rudolph gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles and did his best to drive as carefully as he could. He knew they would only need to cover a very short distance, but every inch on that cliff felt like torture. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they made it past the cliff and into the neighborhood. They picked up the deceased person's body and then turned right back around and did the same process of slowly driving past the cliff, and then finally, once they were on the other side, they headed back to the funeral home. And by the time they finally got back there, it was almost sunrise, and Rudolph's wife at this point was wide awake, standing by the front door. And the totally overwhelmed look on her face made Rudolph's stomach drop. He didn't need to ask her what was wrong. He could tell by the bags under her eyes that she must have been up all night answering phone calls intended for him, meaning more people must have died. So, as soon as Rudolph and the driver had moved the second body into the funeral home, they got back in the car to go pick up another, and then another, and another. By 10 a.m., there were 9 bodies waiting in the morgue, and the phone kept on ringing. Four hours later, at 2 p.m. on that Saturday afternoon, a man named August Chambone pulled into the driveway of his stately home in Denora. August was the town mayor, but he'd recently been away on business. So, when he walked inside, he immediately went to the pile of messages his family had written down for him while he was gone. And as he worked his way down the stack of paper, his face went pale. Like many people in Denora, August had had no idea that a mystery illness was suffocating people to death all over town, until he saw all these panicked messages from residents, doctors, and morticians begging him for help. August realized he had a very serious emergency on his hands. Denora didn't have a single hospital, and several of the town's doctors were too sick themselves to work. so people who fell ill literally didn't have anywhere to turn. Meanwhile, bodies were piling up. Between Rudolph's funeral home and the others in town, the death toll was now at 11 people, and based on the calls he'd received, August estimated that hundreds, maybe even thousands more people were sick. August spent the rest of the day doing whatever he could to help. He worked with local nurses to create emergency medical stations. He called in doctors from out of town to come help. He had extra oxygen and inhalers shipped into Donora. He even called the state health department for backup. But at the same time, August didn't make any emergency announcements. But in fairness, he didn't really have a way to. Donora didn't have a local TV or radio news station, and the newspaper was only published on weekdays. And since this disaster had happened on a weekend, the only way for news to travel was by word of mouth. So, while half the town did their best to deal with this mysterious outbreak, the other half was blissfully unaware, carrying on business as usual. The local high school even went ahead with their scheduled football game, even though their players literally couldn't see more than a few feet across the field. But finally, after what felt like one of the longest days of his life, August felt like he needed to call a town meeting. Everybody needed to know what was going on. However, he couldn't get everybody from the city council and the Board of Health together until the following morning. And so first thing the next morning, which was Sunday, October 31st, August made his way through the thick gray fog to a government building downtown. There, he met with a bunch of community leaders to discuss what was going on, and they all agreed that the fog must have something to do with it. But there were a lot of questions that nobody could answer, like what made this fog different? And why was it making some people sick and even killing some people, while others seemed totally unaffected by it? They couldn't make sense of it, let alone figure out how to stop it. Then, at some point during their conversation, August began to hear rain pattering down on the roof. He looked out the window and saw the drizzle turn into a full-on downpour, and he watched in amazement as the rain seemed to wash the fog away. The thick gray clouds that had hung over Donora for nearly a week disappeared in minutes. And with it, the mysterious illness disappeared too. Just like that, the phones at Donora's doctor's offices stopped ringing. It would take years for public health researchers to understand what had happened during that October week in Donora, Pennsylvania. And that's because there was essentially a large-scale misinformation campaign to hide the truth. However, eventually, the truth came out. The so-called fog that blanketed Donora that week was not actually normal Donora fog. It was smog from Donora's many industrial mills. These mills manufactured steel, zinc, and sulfuric acid, and as part of that process, they pumped dangerous chemical byproducts directly into the air. Normally, the smog would float up towards the sky and dissipate quickly. But during October 1948, Donora was hit by a very rare weather event called a temperature inversion, which in short kept these dangerous chemicals down at street level for days. It worked like this. Usually, air is warmest near the surface of the Earth and gets colder as it goes upward towards the sky. But during a temperature inversion, this gets flipped around. Warm air moves into the space above cold air and traps the heavier cold air underneath it. And when this happened in Donora, which was situated inside a natural bowl in the Earth, the warm air was almost like putting a lid on top of that bowl. And so the deadly chemical byproducts from the mills were trapped, turning the air in Donora into a concentrated poison. But because fog was so normal in the valley, most people didn't think anything of it. Plus, throughout that very consequential week, and for years afterwards, the owners of the mills insisted they were not to blame, putting out a blizzard of misleading information to defend themselves. They claimed the weather was the problem, not the chemical byproducts. And many locals believed this, because they didn't want the mills to shut down. 2/3 of the men in Donora worked there, and the majority of families in town depended on that income. All told, at least 70 people died as a result of what became known as the Donora smog, and over 4,000 people were sickened. Experts said that X-rays of survivors' lungs looked like victims of chemical warfare. The Donora smog incident was the worst air pollution disaster in United States history. But it also sparked a national conversation about air pollution and the need for better industrial safety regulations. 2 years later, in 1950, the US held its first ever National Air Pollution Conference. After that, progress was slow but steady. The nation's first major air pollution law was passed in 1963, and the Environmental Protection Agency was formed in 1970. As of today, all of Denora's industrial mills have been shut down. There's now a museum in that town that commemorates those who lost their lives during Denora smog, and proudly displays the slogan, "Clean air started here." At 7:20 p.m. on Friday, January 12, 2007, 19-year-old college freshman Wade Steffi walked into Ford Dining Hall, which is one of 5 dining halls on Purdue University's campus. Purdue is a prestigious American university located in Indiana that is known for its excellent athletics and academics. Wade, who was an aviation technology student and was at Purdue on a full academic scholarship, grabbed some food and then sat down at a table with some friends. This was the first Friday of the 2007 spring semester, and so Wade and his friends at the table and the hundreds of other students that were sitting all around them were buzzing with excitement about what they were up to that night and what they were up to that weekend. And so Wade and his friends, they sat there chatting about their plans for about an hour, and then at around 8:20 p.m., Wade realized he needed to leave, and so he stood up, he said goodbye to his friends, he carried his tray to the trash can, and then he made his way out of the doors he came in on. And so once he was outside of the dining hall, he immediately turned right and walked the very short distance to the building that was right next to Ford Dining Hall. And so that building was called Owen Hall, and it was a dormitory. Now, this was not Wade's dormitory. He actually lived in a different dorm called Cary Quad West, which was located on the other side of Ford Dining Hall. And so Wade goes inside of Owen Hall because he has some friends in there, and he makes his way to their room, and when he goes inside, he sees they're all kind of sitting around chatting and drinking some alcoholic drinks. And so Wade sits down and he has a couple of drinks and he just hangs out with his friends for about an hour. And so around 9:30 p.m., Wade and the other people he was with in this room, they left Owen Hall and they walked the half mile away from campus to the west to this huge party at a fraternity. And so Wade would stay at this fraternity for several hours until about midnight, at which point he pulled one of his friends aside and he told them that he just remembered he had left his jacket inside of Owen Hall, and so he wanted to go back and retrieve it. The dorms on Purdue's campus all lock at night, and so the only way you can get inside is if you live there and so you have a key, or if you know someone who lives there who will open the door for you. And so during his walk back to Owen Hall, Wade would make 6 phone calls in an attempt to get someone in Owen Hall to open the door for him. But 4 of his phone calls would just be the wrong number. And so the people that were picking up and he was asking to open the door, they didn't know what he was talking about, and so they hung up. But he did call 2 people that did live inside of Owen Hall. However, they didn't answer their phones. And so around 12:30 a.m., Wade arrived at Owen Hall. He put his phone back in his pocket and he just walked up to the doors, which were locked, and he just started knocking. And eventually a resident of Owen Hall who didn't know Wade and Wade didn't know them, they heard the knocking and they came out to the door to see what was going on. And they looked through the glass and they saw Wade, and apparently they decided that Wade looked too intoxicated to let into the building, and so they refused him entry. And so Wade apparently stood there, he kept knocking for a little bit, but he eventually just kind of gave up, he turned around, and he walked away. Fast forward a few days to Tuesday, January 16th, and Wade's roommate, who had actually been gone all the past weekend, he returned, and the first thing he noticed when he got back to his dorm was that Wade was not in the dorm. And so he called and texted Wade, but he didn't get a response. And so the roommate went out around the floor that they lived on to ask people if they had seen Wade, and no one had seen him since the previous Friday. And so starting to get pretty concerned, the roommate called Wade's family to see if maybe they knew what was going on with him.
but his family had no idea. And so by the end of that day, the police had been contacted about Wade potentially being missing, and they in turn contacted Wade's cell phone provider, and they were able to determine that Wade's cell phone was still showing up somewhere on Purdue's campus, although they couldn't figure out exactly where. So that evening, a massive campus-wide search was launched with hundreds of police officers and volunteers. Even the school's equestrian club came out with their horses to search the nearby woods. But despite this huge search effort that would go on for several weeks, the only thing they would find of Wade's was one of his shoes. It was found on January 20th, so just 4 days into the search, and it was located right outside of an exterior door that led into a maintenance room inside of Owen Hall. But when they searched this maintenance room, Wade wasn't in there. Finally, after nearly a month of searching, when they still had not found Wade, the official search was called off. On March 19th, roughly 2 months after Wade had been reported missing, a maintenance worker was downstairs in the laundry room of Owen Hall when they heard a strange popping sound. At first, the worker thought it was actually coming from one of the washers or dryers that was on, and maybe there's a loose coin or some piece of metal that was inside of the washer or dryer that's getting banged around inside, and that's making the sound. And so this worker began walking around the laundry room, kind of listening in to each of the washers and dryers that were on to see if they were making this sound. And so as he's doing this, he hears the popping sound again, but it's clearly not coming from any of the washers and dryers. In fact, it's not even coming from inside the laundry room. It's coming from somewhere out in the hall. Curious, he leaves the laundry room and he goes out into the hall, and as soon as he's standing in the hall, he hears the popping sound again. And this time, it was obvious that it was coming from behind the closed door that was directly opposite the laundry room. So the worker pulled out his big set of keys, he opened the door that was directly in front of him, and he stepped inside. Moments later, he would make a big discovery. Based on that discovery and the investigation that would follow it, this is a reconstruction of what happened to Wade Steffi. In the early morning hours of January 13th, right after Wade had been denied entry into Owen Hall because the student who was in there who didn't know him thought he was too intoxicated, right after that happened, Wade left the front doors and made his way around to the left side of the building to look for another way inside. And when he got to the left side of the building, he found another door. Now, even though this door did not have a sign on it that said "keep out," it was fairly obvious that this door was not designed for students to use. There was a metal railing that lined the outside of this door, clearly to prevent pedestrians from getting to the door, and the door itself was actually not built at ground level. It basically was built at basement level. So you'd be standing at this railing looking down at the door, and down in front of the door was a slab of cement right out in front of it that gave the door enough clearance to be able to open. And so basically there was a railing around a pit, and that was where the door was. The proper way to get to this door was to literally climb over that railing and jump down into this pit. And then you'd need a key to open this door because it was always locked. Well, it was supposed to always be locked. And so when Wade saw this clearly off-limits door on the side of Owen Hall, in his drunken state, he decided it would be a good idea to try to go into it. Because in his mind, he thought, whatever is behind this door doesn't really matter. As long as I can just get inside of some part of Owen Hall, I can find my way up to my friend's room and I can get my jacket. And so he rushes over to the railing, he climbs over, he leaps down into that pit area, he grabs the doorknob of this off-limits door and he pulls on it, and it's open. So he opens it up, he steps inside, and it's totally pitch black. And all he can hear is the sound of machines humming and whirring in the darkness. And again, in his drunken state, he decides this is still a good idea. His only concern was he couldn't find a light switch, and it really was basically pitch black in here. And he was worried once the door shut, not only would his only light source be totally cut off, but it it might actually lock behind him and then he'd be trapped inside of this room. And so he took off one of his shoes and he tucked it in the door jamb of the door he came in on to keep it open. And so with the door propped open behind him, he began walking into this room. And pretty much right away, he bumped into this big metal structure. He couldn't see what it was because, again, it was too dark, but he could feel it and he could tell, it was a flat metal structure. It felt like a machine of some kind, and he could hear that it was one of the machines that was buzzing and whirring. And so he just decided he would try to walk around it. Because again, his goal is just to get through this room and find another door somewhere and kind of continue his journey up into the dorm. And so Wade began moving his way left along this machine, kind of believing it was going to come to a stop at some point, and then he could walk around it. But it would turn out this machine was very big, very wide. And so by the time he actually got to the left edge of this machine, he was practically right up against the wall of the room he was in. And when he got there, he realized the space between the side of the machine and the wall of the room was big enough that if he turned sideways, he could basically squeeze his way past it. Now, he had no idea how far into the room this strange machine went, but in his drunken state, he decided it was a good idea. And so he turns sideways, so his back is to the wall of the room, and his chest is going to be facing the machine, and he begins pushing himself into that narrow space. And so as he's making his way, his hands are up, kind of protecting his face and neck, and at some point, he kind of begins to trip. Now, he didn't actually fall because he's basically wedged into this tight space, but for a second, he reflexively grabbed with his hands onto this machine right in front of him, and just by chance, his left ring finger slipped into a very narrow hole that was about 2 inches deep. The room that Wade was inside of was called an electrical vault, and it contained 6 large transformers, one of which Wade's finger had just stuck inside of. The job of these 6 transformers is to take the high voltage they receive from the main power grid and then transform it, hence the name, into lower usable voltage that gets dispersed into Owen Hall for residents and teachers. Even though the outside of these transformers had mostly been covered with protective materials that mitigated the electrocution risk, there were still several parts of these machines that there was just nothing you could do. They just presented a really high electrocution risk. And one of those sections you needed to be extra careful with was that 2-inch hole that Wade's finger slipped inside of. At the back of that hole was an exposed electrical conductor, and the second the tip of his finger touched that conductor, between 2,000 and 4,000 volts of electricity were pumped into his body. For reference, when people get executed via the electric chair, they are electrocuted with 2,000 volts of electricity. Wade likely died instantly. But because of the fact that he was kind of wedged between the transformer and the wall, after he died, he didn't just slump onto the ground. Instead, he remained in a semi-upright position with his finger still stuck inside of that hole. And so for the next 2 months, his body just continued to be electrocuted every second. Finally, sometime in March, as a result of Wade's body fluids draining out of him, the electrical current that was being pumped into him altered its course and began snapping outside of his skin into the ground. And so the sound of the electrical current actually striking the ground was that popping sound that the maintenance worker heard. The door that the maintenance worker opened in order to investigate the sound was the only other door that led into the electrical vault, the other being the exterior door that Wade had gone in on. Initially, when the worker opened that door and looked inside of the vault, he actually didn't see Wade, but he smelled something funny, and that was what led him to walk into the room and make his way around, and that's when he spotted Wade's body. Earlier, on January 20th, when they found Wade's shoe, which at some point had just slipped out of the door jamb, so it was not propping open the exterior door when it was found, it was just sitting in that pit area, and the exterior door was shut. And so when they found that shoe, the police, they did go inside of the electrical vault, but they didn't go in through the exterior door. They went around and went in the same door that the maintenance worker opened from right across the hall from the laundry room. And when they opened it up, they just looked into the room. They didn't walk into the room, they just looked from the doorway, and from their perspective, They couldn't see Wade, and so that was why initially they had said, Wade is not inside of that room. Ultimately, because that exterior door to the electrical vault was supposed to be locked at all times, and clearly it was not because that's how Wade got in, Purdue was found to be negligent, and so they agreed to pay Wade's family $500,000, and they also set up a scholarship in Wade's name. Before we get into our next story, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, BetterHelp. When I first sought out therapy to try to deal with some of my mental health issues, I remember feeling really nervous about that first interaction with the therapist. The idea of sitting in this room and pouring my heart out to this person I barely knew seemed really stressful and almost made me not want to go through with it. Now, I'm glad that I did go through with it because therapy has been an extremely important and positive thing in my life, but I wish there had just been an option to take a phone call with my therapist to kick off the relationship. Well, with BetterHelp, that is an option because BetterHelp is an online therapy platform that offers secure phone call sessions as well as video sessions, and they have a great chat feature that allows you to message your therapist at any time. So far, the people from our strange, dark, and mysterious community who have given BetterHelp a shot have been very pleased with their experience. BetterHelp is very easy to sign up for and use. You just fill out this questionnaire that helps assess your specific needs, and then within 48 hours, you're paired up with a therapist. Then you begin to schedule your sessions with or without video. If at any time you want to change your therapist, it is free and easy to do so. So if you're struggling right now with your mental health, but you've held off starting therapy because maybe you are intimidated about starting the process, then I would highly encourage you to make BetterHelp your starting point. And you get 10% off your first month if you go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen. Again, that's betterhelp.com/MrBallen. Okay, back to the stories. During the California Gold Rush of 1848, hundreds of thousands of Americans living on the east coast of the United States packed up their things in covered wagons and headed west for California to attempt to, quite literally, strike gold. About a year after the rush started, so in the winter of 1849, a group of about 100 would-be gold prospectors were on their way across the continental United States to California when they got lost in this totally barren stretch of desert, roughly 500 miles from their destination, which was San Francisco. They would spend the next 2 months driving around this desert looking for a way out, but they wouldn't find it, and so finally they just stopped, set up camp, and waited to die. But as a last-ditch effort, they sent ahead 2 of their fittest men to try to go out and find help. And miraculously, those 2 men would find help, and it wasn't long before the lost pioneers were going up and over this mountain pass out of the desert out to safety. And so as the pioneers are cresting this mountain, one of the pioneers turns and looks down at the desert valley below where they almost all died. And he famously said, "Goodbye, Death Valley," and the name stuck. While Death Valley has since become a very popular tourist destination for adventurous people, it is still truly one of the harshest environments on the planet. In addition to just being a big open desert, which presents a whole host of problems to any mammal, Death Valley also becomes one of the hottest places on the planet every summer. The temperatures soar to 120 degrees Fahrenheit and sometimes get as high as 136 degrees Fahrenheit. It's the kind of place where if you don't respect it, it will kill you. In 2005, a 35-year-old man named Robert Darmer, who lived in Los Angeles, California, decided he wanted to take a trip into Death Valley. Specifically, he wanted to go to the hot springs located in the northwest corner of Death Valley, and actually there's a nudist resort that is right around those hot springs, and so Robert wanted to go check that whole scene out. And so on July 26th of that year, Robert left Los Angeles in his Volkswagen van, and he drove north about 4 hours until he got to Bishop, California, which is a small town where some of his family lived. After spending the night with them, the next morning when Robert got up, he got back into his van and he drove south about 20 minutes to a town called Zurich, California, where he picked up Death Valley Road. This road covers the entirety of Death Valley, starting from its northern entrance, where Robert was, all the way south 140 miles to its southern entrance. And this road is actually basically a straight line. But off of this very straight road are literally hundreds of miles of unpaved roads that splinter off in all directions across the desert. And these roads bring people to other points of interest, like, for example, the nudist resort that Robert wanted to go to. So after Robert hopped onto the Death Valley Road at its northern entrance, he began driving south for about an hour, and then he began looking for the turnoff to the unpaved road that would take him the last 50 miles to the nudist resort. And so eventually Robert believes he's found this turnoff, and so he gets onto this unpaved road and he starts driving for a while, and then all of a sudden his car just sinks down into the ground and it won't budge. It would turn out Robert had made a mistake. He had not turned onto the correct unpaved road. Instead, he had picked a road that led right out onto this salt flat, and so to the naked eye it would have looked like the ground in front of him was totally flat and hard packed, and you could easily walk on or drive on it. But in reality, the surface of the salt flat is very brittle, and underneath that brittle surface is this thick section of mud. And so before Robert could realize his mistake, he had broken through the surface layer of the salt flat and got stuck in that mud. After trying unsuccessfully to get his van back out again, Robert realized he was in a really bad situation. His cell phone had no reception, so he couldn't contact anyone, and he was too far away to attempt to walk to the nearest civilization to try to get help. But luckily, he had packed lots and lots of water that was in his van, and so he decided the only thing he could do was just sit tight at his van, ration out his water, and wait for someone on Death Valley Road to look out and see him and come to his rescue. But after waiting for 6 days, no one saw him. And now his water supply was dwindling, and so Robert decided his only option was to abandon his van and make the walk to civilization. And so he packed up all the water he could, he threw it on his back, and he began to walk. And just like the lost pioneers of 1849, at the very last second, Robert was rescued. As he stumbled across the desert, his canteen empty, this group of teenage boys and a few adults who were part of this group called the League of Venturers were out in Death Valley doing search and rescue training. And so they literally turned onto the same road that Robert accidentally turned onto and then got stuck on. And so they came down and found Robert. And Robert, when he saw them, he was hysterical. He was crying tears of joy. He really believed he was going to die probably that day. And so the League of Venturers, they take Robert into their van and they drive him 80 miles to the nearest ranger station. And as soon as Robert got out of the car, he dropped to his knees and he kissed the ground in appreciation. I mean, this guy really was that close to death. That evening, Robert would hitch a ride from the ranger station back to Bishop, California, and the next morning, Robert spoke with a local towing company, and they agreed to drive him out into Death Valley to locate his van and tow it back out again. But when they got out there and they found his van, the towing company saw that the van was not in good shape. It had 2 flat tires, and there were several other mechanical issues with it. And they told Robert, look, we can't tow it out until the repairs are made, and we can't make those repairs right now. And so they left the van where it was, and they drove Robert back to Bishop. And then when they got there, Robert, who was quite handy with his van, decided he would just make the repairs himself. And so he went around town, he gathered up all the supplies he would need, and then that evening, he got a local young couple to give him a ride back into Death Valley. Robert had told his family right before he left that his plan was to go and fix his van, and then that night come back to Bishop, and then the next day, he would contact the towing company again, and they could come out and they could get his van out. But that night, Robert did not come back to Bishop, and the next morning, when his family still had not heard from him or seen him, they contacted authorities. It would take a few days, but the authorities would eventually figure out what happened to Robert. The young couple that gave Robert a ride back into Death Valley, they dropped him off at this intersection right off of Death Valley Road, where they and Robert believed was only about a mile away from that nudist resort that Robert had originally wanted to go to. Robert had told the couple that his plan was just to walk from that point. He would go to that resort and he would recruit somebody else to drive him the rest of the way to the van. He could make the repairs and that person would drive him back, and that would be it. So Robert got out. He said thank you to the couple and he waved to them as they drove off, and then he stashed his van supplies and then turned away from Death Valley Road and began walking along this unpaved road into the desert. However, unbeknownst to Robert or to the couple, the spot he was dropped off was the wrong spot. He was not a mile or less away from this resort. He was about 15 miles away from this resort, and the path was fairly circuitous, so even if he knew the distance, he likely would not have been able to even navigate his way there. And so after wandering down this unpaved road for about 10 miles, Robert left the unpaved road and began heading out into open desert, likely seeking water. Robert would eventually collapse and die just 4 days after he had been rescued from the exact same situation. When his body was found, he didn't have a GPS or a map or even a container for water. In late 2002, 25-year-old Jason Chase worked as a sheep shearer in an area called Gisborne, which is located in the northeastern section of New Zealand. When Jason wasn't working, he was often on his bike, cycling up and down the coast, preparing for his next road race. In early December of that year, Jason contacted his family, who lived in a small town called Dannevirke, which is located about 200 miles southwest of Gisborne, and he told them that he wanted to come visit them for Christmas. However, he didn't know exactly when he would actually arrive at their house because his training and work schedule were fairly hectic, but he told them, "Don't worry, I will be there at least on Christmas Day, December 25th, or a couple of days earlier." His family was thrilled, and they said, "No problem, we can't wait to see you whenever that is." And so by the time mid-December rolled around and Jason still had not arrived at his family's home in Dannevirke, his family wasn't concerned at all. However, that would soon change. On December 13th, a hunter was driving along the many winding back roads of the Ruahine Mountain Range. This mountain range, which is located about 8 miles north of Dannevirke, is a very isolated and rugged wilderness area that's full of steep gorges and gullies and very thick brush. And so as this hunter rounds the turn on this road, he looks up ahead and he sees there's a car parked on the side of the road. And so this hunter pulls up right alongside this car and he looks over and he can tell, there's no one inside of it, there's no obvious damage to the car. And then the hunter began kind of scanning around the area to see if there was some obvious reason someone would stop right at that particular spot. But when he looked around, all he saw was thick trees on either side, and the mountain kind of sloped down on either side. And so there was nothing unique about this spot. And so something just kind of struck the hunter as odd about this car. It just seemed totally out of place. And so operating on a hunch, the hunter would leave the mountain range and head into Dannevirke, and he would contact police and he would tell them about this car and where it was located, because in the hunter's mind, maybe someone had been reported missing in the area and maybe this car is connected. And so after hearing about the car, the police did not know of any missing person cases that were connected to a car that matched the description the hunter had given. But just to be safe, the police hopped in their vehicles and they drove up into the Ruahine Mountain Range, and they went to the spot the hunter described, and sure enough, off to the side of the road is this parked car, and it's still unoccupied. After inspecting the vehicle, the police came to the same conclusion the hunter did, that there was no obvious signs of damage to the car that might have forced someone to abandon it. And then when they looked in the window at the gas gauge, they saw the gauge was full. And so the police kind of wandered around the area, kind of doing an initial search to see if maybe the owner of this car was nearby, but there was no one there. They're in this very isolated part of this wilderness area. And so the police just took down the license plate of the car and they went back to their station. And when they got there, they ran the license plate number, and it turned out the car belonged to Jason Chase. When Jason's family was contacted about, why is Jason's car up in the Ruahine Mountains, where's Jason? His family was pretty surprised. They explained to police that Jason had made plans to come visit them around Christmas time, and so they were expecting him to come this way. And the Ruahine Mountain Range, it is only 8 miles away from Dannevirke, so in theory maybe he stopped there on the way to their house, but they told police that just didn't make any sense. So as a precaution, the police decided to launch a search for Jason. And unfortunately, despite hundreds of people on the ground searching the Ruahine Mountain Range and helicopters overhead flying all over the place, no trace of Jason was found. And so the official search was called off right before Christmas, but Jason's family and friends, they continued to look for him. and on January 3rd, they would find him. One of the family friends who had agreed to continue looking for Jason after the official search had shut down was a farmer who owned a plane. And on January 3rd, as he did one of his passes over the foothills of the Ruahine Mountain Range, he looked down and he saw this bright red thing that looked totally out of place, and the pilot couldn't tell what it was, and so he took note of its location, and then when he landed, he passed those coordinates off to the ground team. And so the ground team, they made their way over to this location, which was quite far away from where Jason's car had been, and after making their way through some very thick brush and some very steep sections, they eventually walked out to this big open clearing. It was a dry riverbed, and right in front of them, in the middle of it, was the bright red thing. It was Jason's shirt, and Jason was still wearing it. He was found lying on his left side with his legs stretched out. He had on his bright red rugby t-shirt, some khaki shorts on, and he had no shoes or socks on. According to the searchers who first saw Jason in this dry creek bed, they would say the scene was very peaceful, and it almost looked like Jason had lied down to fall asleep. But Jason was not sleeping, he was dead. Jason had no visible injuries, and there was no sign of a struggle in the area. In fact, it didn't even look like Jason had been in the wild for very long because his clothes were pristine, and despite being barefoot, his feet were in great condition. Despite a lengthy search around the area where his body was discovered, his shoes and socks would not be recovered. The only thing they found in the area was a water bottle that belonged to Jason. Adding to the mystery of what happened to Jason were the results of his autopsy. The pathologist was unable to find any injuries. Jason also seemed well nourished because he had food in his stomach, and he was hydrated because there was urine in his bladder. His toxicology report also came back negative for all drugs, medications, and a range of common poisons. The only odd thing the pathologist found during the autopsy was that Jason had 2 very small ulcers in his duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. According to this pathologist, these type of ulcers only appear from acute stress moments before death. However, these ulcers don't indicate what caused the stress. Typically, things like severe injury or septicemia, which is blood poisoning, will cause these stress ulcers. But Jason had neither of those. So at the end of the autopsy, the pathologist concluded that Jason had not been the victim of a homicide, he had not committed suicide, he had died from, quote, obscure natural causes. Interestingly though, the pathologist was able to determine with some certainty that Jason died on or around December 30th. Which means he was alive for the entirety of the official search for him, as well as the bulk of that private search conducted by friends and family. After the autopsy results came out, Jason's case was closed, and his family, despite having lots of unanswered questions, was forced to just move on. 15 years later, the same pathologist that had conducted Jason's autopsy was talking to a colleague about Jason's case, and as he was describing where Jason was found, the colleague suddenly stopped the pathologist and said, "Wait a minute, I think I know what happened to him." And it would turn out he did. The following is a reconstruction of what happened to Jason Chase. On December 13th, 2002, Jason left his home in Gisborne and began heading south towards Dannevirke, where his family lived. But before he got to his family's home, he took a detour up into the Ruahine Mountain Range, where he eventually parked his car on the side of the road. Once his car was stopped, he got out and collected his backpack and sleeping bag. Those were 2 items that were never discovered during the search or after his body was found, but it was later determined they were missing from his vehicle. And so after he has his pack and his sleeping bag, he also grabs a water bottle, and then he leaves the main road and begins walking into the woods, making his way down the mountain. He eventually would find a spot on the side of the mountain that he liked, and so he set up a campsite. What happens next is very confusing because we don't actually know why Jason actually went camping in the first place or when he intended to leave, but we can make one assumption. Whatever he was doing in the mountains, he planned on wrapping it up in time to still get to his family's house in Dannevirke on or before Christmas Day, December 25th. So from December 13th, when he first got out of his car and entered the wilderness, until December 25th, it's believed Jason was, by choice, out in the wilderness of the Ruahine mountain range. And so as this huge search is launched for him in the area he is in, it's entirely possible that he either did not see any of the searchers. This is a very rugged and heavily forested area, and so that's not totally outlandish. Or two, even if he did see the searchers, he may not have recognized that they were looking for him, because remember, during that time frame, he didn't think he was in danger. He was out in the wilderness camping by choice. But sometime around December 25th, or maybe a couple of days before, when he needed to leave and go back to Dannevirke to see his family, after packing up his stuff, for whatever reason, he could not get back up to the road where his car was. Either there was some sort of physical boundary, or maybe he got lost. But either way, instead of going back up the mountain, we know Jason actually turned and began going down the mountain, away from the road and away from his car. It's believed Jason actually just decided he would hike his way out of the mountains. He was in great shape, very healthy guy, and he probably figured he could just hike the 8 miles to Dannevirke, and then he could have someone drive him back up and retrieve his car at a later date. But on or around December 30th, Jason was still out in the mountains. And at this point, he had abandoned his backpack and his sleeping bag and had most likely removed his shoes and socks for reasons we don't know. But he had managed to get much closer to Dannevirke. He just had to navigate a few more steep sections and then he'd be home free. And so on or around December 30th, Jason began slowly making his way down the mountainside until he reached a decision point. He found himself standing at the top of 2 very steep gullies that both would bring him down to a dry stretch of riverbed, and so either option worked. It just became a matter of which one is safer. And so after making his assessment about which gully he should take, he made his choice and he made his way down and he reached the dry riverbed. And it was at this point that Jason would have begun to feel a pain in his stomach. And that pain would have gotten worse and worse and worse to the point where Jason likely sat down on this dry riverbed, kind of waiting for the pain to subside, but it wouldn't. It would only intensify. And so as he's sitting there kind of wondering what's going on, his vision would begin to blur, and then he would start to struggle breathing. And before he could deal with all of these strange symptoms that were coming on really suddenly, he lost the ability to move his body and he slumped over onto his left side, and there he would lay until he died. It would turn out the gully that Jason had chosen to go down when he was standing at the top and he had those 2 choices, the one he chose, that one contained a plant called Urtica ferox. This plant, which is endemic to New Zealand, grows leaves that are covered in little rigid stinging hairs that contain a toxin called trifidin. And trifidin, in high enough doses, not only causes stomach pain and blurred vision and trouble breathing, but it also causes total body paralysis and even death. Jason, who according to friends would have known about the dangers this plant posed, likely just didn't see the cluster of plants when he was assessing which gully to go down. And so it wasn't until he was partway down the gully and was in these plants that he realized his mistake. But when he turned to go back up, it was just too steep. And so he was forced to trudge through these toxic plants. And because he was wearing shorts, his lower legs were exposed and they were stung repeatedly. And so he was dealt a lethal dose. The reason the pathologist was not able to identify this as Jason's cause of death is because the stingers on those plants, they don't leave any marks on the human body. And its poison, trifidin, is so rare that when they sent out that toxicology report, they didn't include it. They did not test for trifidin. And so it wasn't until 15 years later when the pathologist's colleague heard that Jason had been found in the Ruahine Mountains that the colleague said, wait a minute, have you checked for trifidin? Because he knew the Ruahine Mountains were home to clusters of that toxic plant. And so sure enough, they went back to where Jason's body had been found, and lining the gully that he had come down were dozens and dozens of those plants.